me of that story of the man born blind, remember? And the disciples said, whose fault is it? Who sinned? He or his parents? Born blind. Sinned when? Before he was born? I guess running with other wild souls going to the casino on the other side. What do you think? But Jesus' response was very simple. Not that he or his parents sinned, but that the good of God might be made manifest. I think that little boy demonstrated the good of God, don't you? Absolute radiant love. And even with his special needs, his mother felt what a gift he was to her. That's pretty awesome. You know, sometimes we judge things by our own perceptions. And I've said before, it's the old, there used to be knothole baseball. Remember that? When I was a kid, you could join knothole and get a card to discount to baseball games with the Cincinnati Reds. Yes, it wasn't the, what are they called? The Royals? Cincinnati Reds. And in the old days, you know, the fences around the wooden fences, people would go to the knotholes to watch the game, and how much could you see? But a small amount. And we, looking through the knothole of life, see a very little bit, and we call that's the good. That's the way it ought to be, forgetting that the whole big picture is the good of God. And whatever we decide for ourselves, whatever we decide we ought to have, or we want or we desire, the universe has so much more. Back in the days when Unity people were pretty much all doing treasure maps, remember those? There was a phrase that it was suggested that you put on your treasure map, this or something better. Keeping yourself open to greater good. I came across a parable, and I have no source for it. I do not know who wrote it, but I made a copy of it. I'd like to share it with you. My father's will, said the young earl. He held that precious paper in his hands. It had just been brought to him by a trusted emissary of his father's house. He knew it was his father's will. There was the family crest and the names of the witnesses, old friends of his dad. But if there had been need of further assurance, he would have found it in the phrases and the terms of the will. Words such as his father had often used, arrangements that he and his father had talked over when he was a small boy at home. The messenger had left. Still, the earl held the will in his hands. It was as if his father were speaking to him. My beloved son, I know that your will is one with mine in forwarding the good of our family and its dependents. I leave you all the riches I have gathered. I trust you to use the wealth wisely. Here are some plans that I have tested for years and that may help you in carrying on our work. My father's will, said the earl again. He looked around the poor room in which he sat. A turn in political affairs had made him an exile from home for many years. Now, as heir, he had become the head of the house. He had only to return and prove his Father's will in the courts, and he would step into the power and the plenty of the earldom. His room was poorly furnished. The winter wind came through the badly made window and door. His clothes were mean and thin. There was nothing of beauty, dignity, or comfort in his surroundings. He was living hardly better than the serfs on the estate of his father. But it comforted him to know and to hold that will, knowing that plenty was within his reach. A nobleman's son, nay, a nobleman himself must live with dignity, he said. It does not befit our exalted name for me to live in want and squalor. The next day, when he went abroad, he held his head up with his inner assurance. He walked with a king-like tread. He knew that he was a man of power and wealth and an honored name. But nothing had changed for him. The ship that would have carried him home lay in the slip before the town, and after a while, it departed without him. The castle on the mountainside stood untenanted. His father's wealth lay in the vaults where it had been kept safe for a generation. The people of the earldom fell into lawless ways and suffered from lack. Quarrels grew among the people. Plans for improvements were given up because there was no wise ruler in the realm. Days passed, and years, and still the earl lived in poverty in a far country. Sometimes he looked at the paper he was still possessed, and he said, "My father's will." But he had yielded himself to some kind of inertia. He went through the years with his father's loving and generous will in his possession, yet he enjoyed none of its bequests. He had never gone to his own country and proved the will. He himself was not the only one to suffer because of his neglect. All those who would have benefited by a wise administration of the Father's will suffered also. Now let's just suppose for a moment that a second messenger should come with an appeal for him to return to his own country, claim his powers, and assume the responsibilities. He has almost come to doubt whether his father's will means anything. But this second messenger pierces through his lethargy. He hunts out the old half-forgotten will and goes home. There he learns that it is all true. The castle is his, the exalted rank likewise. He can administer the earldom, assume his responsibilities, and use the power and wealth in the manner his father had outlined. He lives a full, happy life. Beauty and dignity surround him. There are no more doubts and fears, no more inertia, no more lack, no more mean living by sordid experiments. I wonder, does either scene in this parable reflect anything in your life? Does it remind you of another parable? The prodigal son in the far country, caring for pigs. That's not the best thing you would think for a good Jewish boy. Eating the husks that the hogs ate. A very important thing happened. Let's look at the story. The text But when he came to himself, that's an important line. When he came to himself, when he realized, wait a minute. My Father, it's not God's will that I live like this. God's will is for good. My Father's will is for my good. How many of my Father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my Father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. He realized he didn't have to stay here, that he needed to see his life and see God's will, his Father's will, differently. To see it in a new perspective and realize that God's will for him was absolute good. He got to where he found himself there in that far country by his own willfulness. He asked for his share of his inheritance ahead of time before his father passed. Give it to me now. And the father was willing to give him his inheritance. And he took it and he went to the far country and squandered it. You know, it's easy to do, isn't it? When you rely on the stuff that you personally have held on to and laid hold of, it runs out. Unless you maintain that connection, knowing that God's will for you is absolute good. And that required him to come to himself, to start to see the truth. That as long as I'm trying to do this myself, as long as it's my personal will instead of God's will for absolute good, I'm going to have less. Now, he made the journey back to his father, but I'm going to tell you, there's no magic carpet that popped out of the sky and he got on and he ended up instantaneously transported in front of his father. Oh no, he had to make the journey back step by step, climb by climb, change of consciousness here and there, looking at some of the thoughts and attitudes he held about God's will for him, about what it was prepared for him. When he got back, what did he discover? Even before he was home, the father came out. He rose, came to his father, but while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. I used to have fun with this when I was teaching CEP. I'd ask for a volunteer, and they'd come up, and I'd say, well, you know, I want you to be the prodigal son, and I want you to wander into a far country. And so he'd start to wander around the room, and I'd be right behind him. When he came to himself and turned around, I was right in his face. And that was just an illustration that we don't have to go anywhere except in our own thought. Change our own minds and how we see God's will for us. We know the nature of God is absolute good, correct? Absolute good cannot express desire for you, seek to give you anything less. If we have less than absolute good, it's because we are accepting less. Because we don't realize we deserve it. We don't realize that it's already prepared for us. The Father was there, came out to meet him before he even got home. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. These are great images. images of abundance. A nice robe, clothed with a new consciousness of the presence, the power, and the will of God at work in his life. Ring is spiritual authority, having the authority over your own life to speak the word and to realize that good comes to you because it comes through you. As you recognize that one source. Oh, and new shoes. Who doesn't like new shoes? Feet represent understanding. A new understanding of his relation to God, God's will, and God's relationship to him. Loving Father who provides abundant good and whose pleasure it is to give the kingdom to each one of us. It's a nice story of kind of a turnaround, don't you think? A fascinating story. Now, I know throughout history, throughout the Christian history, we've tried to make sense, and the church has tried to make sense of the will of God and God's will for us. And there have been periods in the church's history where I believed God's will was that they punish anyone who didn't agree with what they taught. There have been times where human beings have thought, well, it's God's will for us to go to war, for us to fight, for us to take our good. It's God's will that we be superior. Well, over our history, I think we've really played with God's will and made a mess of it. When it's a very simple thing. God's will for each one of us is absolute good. When Jesus spoke about the man born blind, it's as if the blindness was not an issue, but perhaps a vehicle for even greater good to come forth for that person. In that music video, Will, the boy, I'm sorry that the screen was so washed out because you didn't get to see him in his little pumpkin suit all stuffed with leaves and the braces on his legs. But Will was a light of God. And as his mother said, every day with Will was a gift. That's not looking through the knothole and seeing, well, this child's not perfect. There's something wrong here. I think the child was perfect. Look at that note that he wrote to the woman who sang the song, his friend, when he was leaving with his mother for California. Me and God love you. And you could tell she cherished that note. A gift of love. Nothing wrong with Will. Nothing at all. Pure, radiant light and love of God. I ask you to begin to look at your life. Begin to see how, like the Earl, you can be the one that holds God's will in your hand and then lives like it's true. Like God intends for you to have abundance. God intends for you to be happy. God intends for you to be healthy. And begin to take the steps. If you need to get out of the far country, get into a different state of consciousness, you need to take those first moves. Realizing this is now not how God intends for me to live. This is not God's will for me. God's will for me is good. Joy, peace, health, wholeness. And take all the steps necessary to begin to plant that idea in your mind and your heart till it becomes so real that you don't question that God loves you, is one with you, and seeks to express its perfection in you and your life and all that concerns you. Now, I'm going to tell you, I liked that music video. I liked it a lot. Anybody get a little moist in the eye? I did when I watched it. And I did the second time I watched it. And it wasn't out of sadness. It was out of realizing the joy of that infinite love. Not my will, but thy will be done. When you look at Jesus' life, there's no great sermon on the will of God. You don't see any big heading in the New Testament where Jesus speaks on God's will for you. But he lived his life expressing that will, living as if that will was for God's good to be made manifest through him, through us, through life. Rather than talk about it, he lived it. And then in a dark hour in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he knew what was coming ahead, the human part said, I don't want to do this. Father, take this cup from me. But that divine spirit within him knew the truth. And he said, but if it be thy will, thy will be done. Not my will, but God's will. Do you say that very often? Not my will, but God's will. It's not easy. It's not easy to say it and surrender to that truth. Releasing your personal will, your little human self-will that sees just a little fraction of the good that's available. That's not the easy way. It's a very hard way. It's filled with struggle and contention. The easy way is to turn your life and your will over to that power we call God as you understand it. And you say, thy will be done. But you say that knowing that God's will is for absolute good. Now, it's not easy to do that, but it is easier than the human way and the human struggle. It is easier. An old expression, let go and let God. Let go and let God bless you with more than you've ever known of life, love, peace, joy, happiness, health, abundance. My Father's will. Think about that. Your Father's will is for your absolute good.